Turkey says it's ready to host direct talks between Russia and Ukraine aimed at reaching a ceasefire and permanent peace. The office of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan says he made the offer in a phone call with French President Emmanuel Macron. The call came after Russia's Vladimir Putin says he is open to direct negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul as early as Thursday. Speaking at a press conference, President Putin did not agree to a 30-day ceasefire to take effect on Monday. That was the demand from the leaders of Germany, Poland, France and the UK, who travelled to Kyiv for talks with President Zelenskyy and also spoke to Donald Trump by phone in Washington. The allies threatened Russia with increased sanctions if it failed to agree the truce. In his national address on Saturday evening, Putin claimed that Russia had always been willing to talk directly with the Ukrainians, despite previously setting conditions that were unacceptable to Kyiv.
Let me repeat once again, we have repeatedly proposed steps to ceasefire. We have never refused dialogue with the Ukrainian side. Let me remind you once again that it was not we who interrupted the negotiations in 2022, the Ukrainian side did.
Our former Moscow bureau chief Juri Rescheto is reporting from Riga after the Kremlin banned DW from Russia. Good to have you with us, Juri. Now, President Zelenskyy has welcomed President Putin's offer of direct talks, but insists the 30-day ceasefire has to be implemented first. So how likely is that to happen?
We'll see. The fact is that the situation looks like a diplomatic ping-pong between Kyiv and Moscow, and neither of them, neither Putin nor Zelenskyy, seems to want to back down. First, the 3-day ceasefire proposed by Putin for May parade, for his parade in Moscow, rejected by Zelenskyy, but still largely complied with by Ukraine. Then Zelenskyy's demand for a long-term ceasefire commented on with a very rude response by ex-President Medvedev and rejected by Kremlin spokesman Peskov. So now comes Putin with his proposal for negotiations, followed immediately by an indirect rejection from Kyiv. And we are hearing now that Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Zakharova said that Russian authorities insist that talks in Istanbul must first begin and then a ceasefire can be discussed. So it's very tricky. I can imagine that negotiations could nevertheless begin, although perhaps not officially. In any case, there is a lot of activity again.
Turkey's President Erdogan has agreed to host these fresh talks. Now, will they happen fast, or is Vladimir Putin just stalling for time?
Well, look, I think that if negotiations actually start next Thursday, as proposed by Putin, they will not end so quickly. The demands of the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, are too far apart. The Russians will probably very much insist on their old demands, above all that Ukraine should become a neutral state and no longer seek NATO membership. And that is exactly what Zelenskyy does not want. But that has been Putin's justification for the war from the beginning. So the best, he said, was too close on NATO, and that is too dangerous for Russians. But Putin, on the other hand, said several times today or in this last night in his speech that he was ready for serious talks. How serious, of course, we'll see.
And, of course, looking back to Saturday when the Western leaders were in Kyiv, they also got US President Donald Trump on board with their phone call. Do you think this will put some pressure on Vladimir Putin to move?
I think the fact that President Trump was called on a cell phone, we remember there was a photo published by the Zelenskyy office showing the 4 European heads of state in Germany, from Germany, France, Poland and Great Britain in Kyiv, talking to Trump on a cell phone. This photo, or rather the fact that Trump was apparently fully in agreement, so on board, as you said, with the European heads of state, that might actually have impressed Putin. But we should definitely wait and see whether Putin's proposal is perhaps just another maneuver to stall for time. Zelenskyy may have spoken of a good signal from Moscow as a reaction to this proposal of Putin, but his office has already warned that a ceasefire is important first and everything else afterwards. And Putin has not yet agreed to a long-term ceasefire. It's therefore possible that we will no longer be talking about Putin's proposal tomorrow, that the diplomatic ping-pong between Kyiv and Moscow, and unfortunately the war and Ukraine, will continue.
Okay, DW correspondent Juri Rescheto, thank you.
French President Emmanuel Macron says Vladimir Putin's offer to negotiate directly with Kyiv is a first step, but not enough. For the reaction from Ukraine itself, let's speak to our correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Nick, it's been a perhaps unexpectedly swift reply from Putin to Saturday's ultimatum from Ukraine and its Western allies for an immediate ceasefire. What are the Ukrainians saying about it?
Well, we've had President Zelenskyy calling it a good sign, but also hinting, making it more than clear that this ceasefire still needs to happen, that it is not either or, that for those talks to go on in Istanbul, as the Russian side has suggested, there would have to be a ceasefire from tomorrow, that 30-day ceasefire that was discussed at the summit yesterday. We saw yesterday the end of the 3-day ceasefire that Putin himself had called for Victory Day celebrations, and drones once again attacking the Kyiv region and other parts of Ukraine. There's been speculation from Western intelligence agencies that there's going to be a massive strike with missiles in the next couple of days on Kyiv. So I think this doesn't change, this doesn't distract from the fact that now Putin has to choose if he's going to go for this 30-day ceasefire or not. They're not going to be distracted or kind of led down a kind of alternative track by this offer from Moscow.
Putin is referring back to failed negotiations in 2022, shortly after he launched the full-scale invasion. Could those talks be a starting point for renewed peace efforts between Kyiv and the Kremlin?
Look, I think Istanbul as a place to meet President Erdogan of Turkey as an intermediary, that potentially works. He is someone who has managed to maintain pretty good ties to both sides. That is a rarity nowadays. But I think going back to that experience of 2022 does not fly from a Ukrainian perspective. Those talks were all basically about Ukrainian capitulation. This was right at the beginning of the war when you had Russian tanks outside Kyiv, and the Russians, for instance, were demanding that Ukraine essentially disbands its army, agrees to never join any Western alliances, and basically makes itself forever vulnerable to renewed Russian attack. That is not something that Ukrainians, after all these lives lost, all these years of suffering, are going to agree to. But certainly President Erdogan, I think, is one of the few people who could make this happen and could actually facilitate some direct talks.
Nick, I'm curious, how are Ukrainians viewing yesterday's summit with the leaders of Germany, France, Britain, and Poland?
I think it is being seen as a significant success. The fact that they were so on message, that they were basically echoing each other's thoughts, the slightly kind of mantra-like repetition of thanks for Donald Trump and his suggestion of a 30-day ceasefire, the fact that they seem to have kind of got everyone back on board and got Zelenskyy and Trump into a kind of better position, and the fact they've basically put Russia on the spot. They have said, either you go with this ceasefire as of tomorrow, we're not going to accept any more 2-3-day or 24-hour ceasefires, either you agree to this or there's going to be more significant pressure. I think that has made things so clear and so difficult for Putin that that's really being seen as a success here in Ukraine. I guess the question is going to be about Western credibility. Do they really have a new package of arms for Ukraine or new sanctions on Russia if Russia doesn't end up buying into the ceasefire as of tomorrow? We'll only know next after this day has passed, but certainly there's now the expectation that the West either has to force Russia into this or really make good on those threats.
That's Nick Connolly in Kyiv. Many thanks, Nick.
Fabrice Pothier is a former policy planner for NATO, and he now focuses on foreign policy and strategic issues for Rasmussen Global Consulting. He joins us from Madrid. Good to have you with us, Fabrice. Now, Putin has proposed steps for a ceasefire, and he says he's always wanted peace negotiations with Ukraine. How serious is he?
I think it's very important in this hour not to fall into the booby trap of Putin's diplomacy. it is very clear what the Western leaders, including Donald Trump, have said, which is you need to start and implement in good faith a 30-day ceasefire for real, sincere peace negotiations to start. It's obvious you cannot have peace negotiations when young men are dying on both sides of the front line. So I think this is where this is a moment where we should not let go the pressure. On the contrary, pressure is working. The threat of possible oil sanctions by the United States have clearly made Putin take the floor yesterday evening and do this speech. But you can see he's doing a typical Putin. He's trying to turn the pressure into putting us in front of a choice. Either you do negotiations or we carry on. And I think it's important that we really start with this ceasefire. There is no negotiation if there is no ceasefire.
Do you think he'll agree to that?
Well, he's trying not to agree with this, and he's been showing that, in facts over the past few months, where every ceasefire has been breached by Russia or not respected by Russia, even from the start. So I think he's got a long track record of not being sincere in wanting to at least put the fight on hold in order to have proper negotiations. So I think this is why it was quite critical. And I was in Kyiv yesterday, what the EU 4 leaders managed to get out of Donald Trump, which is his support for secondary sanctions on all Russian oil and gas transactions in dollar. And that's obviously makes the occupant of the Kremlin think twice. But he's doing a typical KGB man tactic of trying to turn a bad situation into dividing us. And Donald Trump's reaction to his speech last night was, this is great, now negotiations are going to start, we're going to solve this. Well, yeah, but don't forget, without ceasefire, you cannot have genuine negotiations.
As you mentioned Trump there, we've seen obviously the European allies with Ukraine want the US involved. Is Russia keen to keep Trump involved?
Yes, but I think it's key to keep Trump involved on Russia's and Kremlin's speaking points, and I think this is where the high pressure coming from the European three, Macron, Merz, and Starmer has been quite critical here to try to shift Donald Trump from a quite pro-Russia bias to at least a more neutral and a more constructive position towards Ukraine. And we have to hold that position. So I think the US is critical to these negotiations. This is the only broker that I think both sides can agree. The Ukrainians actually need the US to be a broker to make sure that they are not going to be trapped into the Kremlin's endless diplomatic tactics and negotiations. But it is key that Donald Trump stay on the right side that he started to actually follow since the past few days.
Let's touch on another party in this, and that's Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's agreed to host these talks. What's in it for him?
Well, I think Erdogan has always kind of liked to position himself as a broker, as the indispensable man to bring peace or to solve conflicts. He does that in his own region, and this has been his position all along, also on Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine. That's the reason why partly Turkey has not implemented the US-EU sanctions against Russia. So Turkey has been hedging all along, even though they have been also supporting the Ukrainians in terms of military supply. And so I think Turkey has had that in-between position, which in this case could be useful if, again, it is done in the right conditions. And the right condition is a ceasefire that is respected.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Fabrice Pothier, CEO of Rasmussen Global, thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.